right, welcome to Plug and Pay, a talk show where we talk with payroll professionals from all around the world about thought-provoking, interesting topics that are shaping the payroll world today. My name is Mark Oliver Fiedler. I'm the founder and CEO of Payzaar. I'm the host of the show. We release new episodes of the show every 2 weeks, and you can find them on our YouTube channel, on our LinkedIn page, or any of the major podcast sites. So for today's episode, I'm very excited to welcome Kelsey of Kelsey Consultants to the show. Tim, fantastic to have you on. Thank you so much for taking the time. Maybe to get us started, if you just want to tell us a little bit about your background. I know you have a lot of experience in global payroll, and a little introduction about yourself.
Oh, thanks very much for that very warm introduction, Mark. So, hi everyone, my name's Tim Kelsey, and I'm an international payroll consultant. It's glamorous, isn't it? It sounds it. It just means I have to travel a lot and go all around the world. But my payroll career started in 1988, so that probably dates me a little bit. I worked for an organisation called the Medical Research Council, the MRC, and if you haven't heard of the MRC before, you should have done by now. Why? Well, the two scientists who developed the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, I actually have met both of them, and I used to pay them right at the beginning of their careers back in the 1990s. So that's what the organisation did, groundbreaking medical research. I've been a self-employed consultant for the last 20 odd years, working in the area predominantly of payroll training, which is what we're talking about today. And I teach groups of payroll professionals all over the globe, sometimes in person, sometimes remotely via webinars. My business would also engage in consultancy projects with clients, and that often gives me ideas for new into the training market as well, because I think to be an effective trainer, you do need to keep your nose to the coalface to know what's going on, what's hot, what's not in business at the moment.
Fantastic, Tim. So just picking up on that point of training in the payroll space, which is actually a topic that we haven't talked a whole lot about on this talk show, and I'd love to learn more about it. I'm sure audience loves to learn more about it. So maybe we just start by peeling that back a little bit, and I wonder how do you assess the current state of training in the payroll world?
Well, it's a developing feast. I think is the best way to describe it. It is certainly tons better than when I first started my career. So if we wind back to the early 1990s, I was able to take what was known then as the Certificate of Payroll Proficiency, which involved spending 2 whole days with a trainer going over the basics of UK payroll, and then there was a half-day exam at the end of it. The equivalent of that now would be the CIPP diploma in the UK, where students are going to be studying for a year or more over a wide range of topics. So there's the development over the last 30 years. To be qualified, we went from 2 days to a year's worth of training. So it's come on a great deal during my career, but it also needs to be developed further. I still think that the people who are delivering training today, people like myself, who had their educational experiences in maybe the 1970s and the 1980s, we're not necessarily attuned into how young people like to learn today, and I think we've certainly got a long way to go before training is absolutely perfect. I think one of the other issues here, where are the resources? Well, more and more government departments are starting to provide free training courses, but do you really want to be taught by the gamekeeper, as we say in the UK? We are, after all, the poachers. So we perhaps don't always need training given to us by the tax authority. That will often be the cheapest option. It will be free, but it won't explore the possibility of what if. That training tends to be very do it this way. It won't open your mind to the possibility of doing things differently. We've got many more professional bodies now representing payroll around the globe. So we have the American Payroll Association, of course, been around for 30 odd years in the United States. We've got the Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals in the UK. But there are many, many more global bodies in Sweden, the Netherlands, and beyond that will deliver training solutions in their country. And we have plenty of standalone training companies who specialize in maybe just payroll, or payroll will be part of maybe a finance offering or maybe an HR offering. That can be a bit frustrating because payroll ends up being seen as some inconvenient bolt on to some of these companies that won't necessarily be the thrust of what they do. But there are specialist training companies out there that just do payroll. They tend to be more switched on into what the market is looking for. I think if you were having a conversation with a careers officer today, they would say to any young person, the key to being relevant in today and tomorrow's employment market is to keep your skills finely honed and up to date. And you can never have too much education, even at my great age. I learn every day on this job by doing the research that I have to do for keeping my material up to date and following up on delegates' questions. So, we've got to view learning as being a lifelong thing. But the resources that we use to undertake that learning are likely to change as we develop our careers. I think when we're at the beginning of our careers, we've always worked like this for thousands of years as human beings. We need a mentor. We need someone with experience and guidance and a cool head, calm manner to give us that initial push into life as a young person. Doing our payroll career for the start in our 20s and early 30s. After that, maybe it's a less formal approach, a more light approach. We need to perhaps take advantage of the internet and how we can deliver things through that. So we're there. It's been developing over 30 odd years of my career, but I think we really do have to take things to the next level over the next 5 to 10 years and really fundamentally look at those resources and how they're going to work for people in their job.
So talking about the resource a little bit, so what I picked up from what you just mentioned is in terms of training, quote unquote, institutions, there are today there are different types, different categories. There's the government sponsored training courses. There's associations like the American Payroll Association or the CIPP and so on who offer training courses. And then independent consultants or training firms, training companies. Do you notice that you already touched a little bit on the sort of the government sponsored training programs, but across those different resources, is there a noticeable difference in terms of how the training is being conducted? Is it like the style, the mechanisms that are being used to train the material? Is it quite different between those different resources?
Yeah, the government trainings when they occur tend to be still following maybe a slightly old-fashioned approach of it will be a physical training at a physical place. Okay. It will be on a certain day. It won't be on any other days. The materials will be perhaps paper-based. They won't necessarily be electronic, because that's quite a cheap way to deliver training, and it fits in with perhaps the authorities' way of doing things. The trainer, after all, probably has to train their own staff, and has got a day job to do as well. I mean, that is the thing to remember, that a lot of trainers have a day job. That what they don't do training all the time. There aren't that many people like me who it would be the meat and drink of their role 24/7. You have to look at the pool of people that are available to be trained. So moving into the associations and the independent training companies, certainly we're seeing, for the longer term qualification style trainings, a push online, and I am a tutor myself on a qualification. It's for international payroll. So with one of the training companies in the UK, that training company certifies all its qualifications through Pearson's Edexcel. That'll be a name that's known around the globe. They're a global training company, so that gives you the assurance that your qualification has been independently benchmarked by someone who doesn't necessarily know a great deal about payroll, but they know an absolute shed load about training and education. So it must meet certain criteria. I think that is a very useful benchmark to look for. Whether it's a professional association who has been given carte blanche by their registration in a particular country to self-certify themselves and how they do that, or whether you're using a third party like Pearson's Edexcel, that's a good thing to look out for in a qualification. And the qualification that I'm a tutor on there, it's two qualifications. There's a level 3 and a level 5. Now, level 5 is set as foundation degree level. It's a very significant piece of study, this, but that let's say you do that qualification, you get it, and a year later you suddenly have an epiphany and you go, I don't want to do payroll anymore, I want to do something else. Well, the great thing about those styles of education is it's a level 5 qualification. You've proved to an employer that you can work at that level as well. So those are useful. Things to look out for when you're picking your training. It's got some meaning in the marketplace if you want to reinvent yourself and become an elephant tamer or whatever it might be that you want to go on and do.
So now we've talked about how training has evolved quite a bit since, you said 30 years ago there was basically a 2-day training and that was it on an annual basis. Now it's a much more comprehensive training regime. Looking forward, from where we are today, you mentioned everything needs to be constantly reevaluated. So in your mind, what are the things that we should be looking at improving over the next 5 to 10 years?
So this is something I feel quite passionate about. The number one thing in payroll training is the time available to people. And training can often be seen as just an inconvenient overhead. It needs to not be that. It's your company's investment in the future. But training doesn't necessarily have to be shelling out for a relatively expensive course. It's about giving people the time to develop themselves in their role. So if I go in and do a health check on a payroll department, which is something I do as part of my consultancy work, it's often in my report because I've observed that they really aren't giving people the time to do any training at all. And I recommend that in any payroll team, you give every member of the team a budget for training. Now, I'm not talking about a cash budget. I'm talking about a time budget. And you have to account for that time as well. It's something that you're required to do as an individual. It's not something that you should be peering over someone's shoulder every week on. It should really form part of the annual review process, I think. the line manager should be looking at how the individual has accounted for their time as part of the training budget. And if they're not using the time, you as the manager would have to say to yourself, well, why aren't they using the time? How up to date are their skills? But equally, as the manager, the team leader, you've got to be prepared to give them the time to spend on this. I receive just a huge wall of information emails coming through because I cover 39 different jurisdictions, and I get that volume of newsletters coming through from various tax and social insurance authorities. I have to have the time to be able to read those. And if I had a payroll supervisor who was responsible for half a dozen jurisdictions in a multi-country payroll center, they would need that time to keep themselves up to date. So just the volume of reading that you have to do in payroll, make sure that people have got the time to do that. And I think that's often lacking in a business's plans. I think training is also one of those things that can be used as a motivational tool to reward people as well. So we can give people a budget of time, but if they hit or exceed their targets, why not push more into that pot? So that's when we could be introducing additional cash sums that could be spent on something a little more tangible rather than having to do it yourself. So that is an area I think the company should look at more. What else could be improved? I mean, we've all obviously just come through the pandemic, and pretty much all training for the last 2 years has been online. Many people are saying this is the future, this is the way forward. Let me tell you now, it is not. I know how many of those students out there are reading their emails at the same time they're supposed to be participating on the course. How many people can you get to interact on an online training session? You very few is the answer.
Right.
If you've got a group bigger than 3 or 4, there will always be people who sit at the back, don't want to answer questions, they want to put themselves forward, maybe they're embarrassed. It's a confidence issue. If you're in a classroom with them, you can see that. But equally, what the last few years has taught us is that there are many more ways that we could use online resource tools to drive training forward. So one of the things I'm thinking about for the future is more bite-sized learning, because how many of us can honestly say that we can concentrate fully on a full day's online training? The tutor finds it a strain. Goodness knows how the students feel when we're getting to hour 7 or hour 8 of the day. When you're in a classroom with someone, you get those breaks, you can have that chit chat, you can read people's faces so much clearer, their body language, you can see if people have understood what they're doing. You can't do proper supervision on exercises either. Whatever the online Zoom type companies will say to you, you can't do what you could do in a classroom. So I'm thinking that the future is very much going to be maybe initial bite-sized pieces of training online, but that will require some sort of follow-up session that's more likely to be in person, so that we can analyze the learning. It's one of the areas I think that we do fall down in payroll training, that we give these courses, but then how much follow-up do we give after the course? I think if we're looking at, let's call it a block of, a standard training day would usually be 9 till 4, maybe 9 till 4:30. So you're probably looking at, in that time, 6 to 6.5 hours of training once you've had breaks, etc. Maybe that is better delivered as 3 2-hour sessions, which is what the APA have been doing for a number of years. They tend to break their learning sessions down into 2 hours, then 2 hours, then 2 hours, because they understand it's difficult for people to absorb all the information in one go. I've always thought the afternoon is the worst slot to be on if you're doing any training, Everyone's switched off after lunch. So they don't really want to take part in it. So I think very much, seeing more things done online, but then having the opportunity to interact at a later stage as a follow-up to the training, I think would be a very important thing to do.
I guess listening to what you're saying, to me it sounds like finding the right balance between that sort of more modular, bite-sized training regime where you don't sit through, an endless session where naturally at some point the attention span and the ability to absorb what's being taught fades. Also reflecting on, your point about giving people the time to, fit the training into their otherwise very busy schedules. And of course also the bandwidth of, the experienced qualified instructors. Tim Kelsey can't be everywhere to educate and train people. So combining kind of more self-paced modular training content with then sort of but you still need to have the dynamic interaction, right? Because it's all just, I'm sitting there watching recording. It's not clear whether that all totally registers, right? That's probably the trick that we need to get to, or the right balance that we need to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's I would agree with that 100%.
Now, talk about improving things, and we're living obviously in a different world today than we lived 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. In terms of the skills that you're teaching today and that you believe we need to focus on going forward, how has that evolved, and where do you think we're going?
Yeah, very much so. In one sense, the old, I should put in inverted commas, skill sets of people of my generation and a bit older are still hugely relevant today. You just it's finding how to transfer that into people's jobs. Now let's get to the nub of a payroll problem. One of the areas that I think companies routinely have trouble with is the answering of employee queries. And often the reason why there is trouble with answering employee queries is that the payroll person who's tasked with answering the query doesn't really understand what the computer does. Now, I don't have a problem with that when I'm talking about UK payroll, for example, because I had to do it manually 30 odd years ago. And that means that I know exactly what the computer is trying to do. I still work out pay manually every week for my wife's small business. So I get tax tables out, national insurance tables, and actually physically write the calculation down and do the sum and come up with the net pay at the end of it. Now, I'm not advocating that we should return to those days. Let me make that very clear. That is not going to happen. But giving younger people that ability to understand the how of what's working behind the computer is very, very important, and that's an area that we need to work on. I don't know if you find this in your general life, Mark. If you are in some sort of retail environment, how many young people can't add up three numbers in their head? I can, and one of the reasons why I can do that, apart from my education back in the 1970s, is the fact that I worked behind a bar at the beginning of my working career as a second job, and you had to add the round up in your head as you went along. So as people said, 2 pints of Raddles, a Coca-Cola, a small white wine, you are adding it up in your head as you go along. Today, they press a picture on a till. They don't have to add it up in their head. So that reasonableness check as well. I mean, the amount of people where you'll ask them a question that's payroll related, and well, I have one here. the UK personal tax allowance is worth £12,570. So if you're a basic rate taxpayer, at 20%, how much does it save you in tax? Many people would say 500 quid. They have no idea what 20% of 12,500, and you've got to find a way of teaching people that nous, that stuff that you would just know instinctively is just plain wrong. Now, I'm not claiming that I've cracked this yet with young people in a payroll setting. We've got to find a way where we can show them how to unpick the technology easily, so that they can make those explanations to our employees when they've got queries. It's not blindingly obvious how to do that. I'm not advocating, as I say, a return to wholesale manual calculations. I think that'd be a ludicrous thing to do. It's working out how we can give that background knowledge so that people understand the how of what the software is doing. The amount of queries where an employee would have contacted a tax authority and they'll have said, "Oh, that's your employer," when in fact it's probably nothing to do with the employer. It's probably how the calculation itself works. But you get a sense that the people in the tax authority probably don't really understand how the blessed thing works either. And I think that's a very dangerous position to get into if we can't explain the how of how this all works.
Yeah. So in a way, going back to the basics, right? You need to be able to follow the basics that sit behind all the technology and the payroll calculations that are happening today, in order to conceptually understand what's going on and explain that to an employee who obviously has much less exposure to taxes and social security calculations, and is looking to get that explanation from you.
Yeah.
If your answer says, "Hey, I just entered the numbers and this is what came out," that's usually not a very satisfying answer for the employee.
Exactly.
Now those are the more sort of technical skills that are involved in being a good qualified payroll professional, right? And being sort of able to articulate to the stakeholders, employees, managers, and so on what's going on. What about other, I'd say, more soft skills for the employees?
You mean those group hugs that the HR lot down the corridor do?
I'm just an open question. Are there other skills that maybe are not today or in the past have been the focus for training that we should be thinking about training people? For example, I had someone I talked to the other day, and they were talking about the meeting culture, like in lots of functions, lots of meetings taking place in between payroll and HR and finance. And their observation was the meetings a lot of times are just not very productive, not well, organized. And so it could be things like that, hey, we need to teach our payroll professionals not just the technical skills of how to run a payroll, but also how to communicate more effectively with partners.
And I think the communication bit particularly is a very important one, particularly going back to those employee queries, the ability to explain to everyone's satisfaction a particularly complex matter. Now, one of the things I always say to younger people that I'm teaching, we've mastered maybe some difficult concept on tax calculations, the cumulative process in the UK, for example. I say to them, look, go home, find one of your grandparents and just run through it with them and say, look, I learned this at work this week. Can I just explain it to you? And let's see how much you can understand from my explanation. And if Granny at the end of it goes, yeah, I think I know what you're on about, dear, you've probably been successful, though. That's probably a good way to approach it. I mean, the actual if you're going to have a career in payroll, you are inevitably going to have to look at those soft skills for management. So that's something that isn't necessarily taught in a payroll context. So those skills of delegation, being able to actively manage another person, all of the foibles that come with having to look after a group of people. I mean, I was a payroll manager. I managed teams of up to 30 odd people. I never want to do that again in my life, Mark. But that was you need a certain skill set to do that.
Right.
In terms of etiquette in the business area, again, I do think that's something that's driven very often by company culture, and the inevitable tedious meetings that don't seem to achieve very much. That's quite difficult to do anything about that, because if that's embedded in a company's culture, it's quite a difficult thing to shift. What I do say to everyone is, if you find yourself in this position, try and be more Finnish. You go to a meeting in Finland, most people will say very little, because the average Finn uses one word where we might use 10. And meetings are for the exact purpose that have been drafted up, and they will not last 1 minute longer than they were advertised for. And everyone will come away usually from that meeting saying, I know exactly what to do next. You couldn't say that in lots of other cultures. So be more Finnish is my advice here.
Talking about cultures. So we talked about training in general and some of the evolution that's taking place. And one of the things that we're, I think, all experiencing is payroll becoming more and more international, whether by design or just companies expand or employees move abroad. So in lots of payroll jobs, the international dimension is something that is increasingly becoming part of the role and becoming more important. So I'm wondering, how does that play into training and education?
This is really important, and it's something that I like to emphasize in all of my courses. I usually include a bit about culture and etiquette for every country I teach, and I think it's something that companies need to spend a whole lot more time focusing on. Just this year, I have run a specialist training course on Japanese culture and etiquette, which would take around about an hour and a half. And I've run that twice. For two different companies have felt the need, because they were launching into Japan, to really find out how things tick in Japan. And if you don't spend time on this, you will come a cropper. I think you've got to be able to read what's going on in a room. If you don't understand how a culture works, it's going to be a very frustrating experience for you. It is well worth spending some time on this if you're going to work in a multi-country team, and you don't have to spend a great deal of money on this. There's a great series of guides out there called the Xenophobes guides. They're written by a national or a long-time foreign resident of the particular country, and they're a light-hearted but reasonably accurate way of gauging how things tick in a particular country. So well worth investing in. Very easy to read. They cost about £5, so they're not expensive to buy. So if I was going to a meeting in a country where I hadn't been before, I would try and find that guide, read it before I went, and that will give me an idea of how things are going to operate in that country. You really don't want to go into a meeting without understanding how all of this stuff works. I mean, you do business with a Brit, and they'll say something like, "Oh, I wonder, would you mind doing this?" I haven't given you an option there, Mark. I expect it done by the time I told you to do it. But to lots of other cultures, that seems to be an option. You know, you've got to understand how all these cultures work. We say that the world has shrunk through globalization. That's not true. What we're seeing in our lifetime at the moment, the differences have never been more accentuated. It's because we come across cultures that we just wouldn't have done before in the past.
Yeah, we need to be more culturally aware, right?
And payroll, you know, it's that great discipline. Why do we all love payroll so much? Because we've got the certainty of numbers and rules, a beginning, a middle, and end, but we get the interaction with people, the employees that we have to take queries from. So, you know, we're not like the geeks in Treasury. We do have to have that warm, caring side where we can interact with employees, answer questions to their satisfaction and a way that they'll understand.
Yeah, the being aware of what the other culture, how it operates that you are now engaging with, reminds me of a nice little anecdote of a friend of mine who went to a meeting in Japan, and everyone took their shoes off. You know, it's just part of the culture that they went. I think they went for dinner, and so they took their shoes off. And this friend of mine, turned out he had a hole in his sock, which was rather embarrassing, you know, but something that you wouldn't expect to become an issue when you're, you know, meeting in a Western culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other dimension of learning and education is technology, and you know, we already touched on everything's become more automated. Computers do a lot of the work. So how do we train on, you know, payroll professionals on changes, evolution, and technology? How much is that a factor in the country?
Yeah, it is a difficult one because the technology that you're using as a payroll professional is often driven by the particular software that your company is going to use. Of course, there's the general technology training on all of those ubiquitous tools, Excel, etc. And you know, I'm hopeless on Excel, but you know, it is something that every payroll professional now should get into. I was just that little bit too old when it was first coming into the office for me to be a natural on it. But if you are an international payroller, you need to develop wider technology skills as well. And the thing I think where I've never seen a training course advertised on it. I'd love to see one, and I'd love to go on it. How to Google effectively. And what I teach on my courses, because I'm often teaching multi-country payroll, if I've got a particular item I have to research for, let's say, Poland. Of course, there are some go-to websites for that, but it's a very simple technique I learned some years ago. Google your problem in Polish. Don't Google it in English, because you won't get the quality of response that you need. But I think that's being able to use Google effectively. That would be a great training course for any young person to go on. Okay. Because where is the number one resource now for answering any query on anything in the world? And the answer is the internet, isn't it?
Yeah.
So knowing how to use that effectively, particularly when you've got a technical matter.
Right.
So I want to find out a complicated formula on how a particular item is calculated. Wow. You've got to get the search criteria just right to get the good technical information back to answer the query. So time spent on that, I think, would be a good one. It's amazing how many IT departments in companies don't pay any attention to this at all, and just think people will get on with it in their own lives, as it were. I think it's something that does need to be taught. So we've got the software itself. I do think we need better sort of IT based basics training to allow people to go on and use that software effectively. Because we've all, Mark, you've used various payroll products over the years, you get to learn their little foibles, don't you?
Yeah.
And until you've learnt that, you can't really effectively use the tool to its best approach. So yeah, plenty of opportunities out there, I think, to improve technical training provided by the software providers. Yeah, how to get the best out of your product.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Well, listen, I think this brings us kind of to the end of the session. What we'd like to do at the end is we do something that's called the lightning round. The way it works is I ask you a set of questions and you just give short answers, whatever comes to mind first.
Okay.
Just a little fun. Nothing too serious. There's no right or wrong answers, obviously. So first question is, what's the weirdest or funniest thing that you've ever been asked by a student in one of your trainings?
So many weirdest things.
Could be a long list. Could be your whole afternoon.
I'll give you an example of the best answer I ever had to a question. So I usually try and mix training up with quiz sessions, and you always put a fun question in a quiz, just to sandwich between two technical payroll points. You put a session in. I was teaching this particular group in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai, so no one is an Emirati. They're all from either the Indian subcontinent or the Philippines, I think. So we had Sri Lankans, Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladeshis. And the question I decided would be perfect for that session was, who will win the next Cricket World Cup? Because it was going to happen in like 8 weeks after the training. So you're expecting them to write India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, that sort of thing. One group wrote the bookies. And I went, that is the right answer to that question, because the bookies win always the sporting events, don't they? The one person who's guaranteed to win a sporting event is a bookie. So that was the best answer I'd ever had to a question, I think.
Next question. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A train driver.
Train driver?
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. When I left school, I didn't go to university. I did A-levels, so I left at 18. I worked for Sainsbury's for 4 years as a trainee manager, and then I got my job in payroll. At the same time, I applied for a job with the railway company around here in the signal box, and it was touch and go which one I went for.
Oh, wow.
And I sometimes wonder what would have happened in life if I'd have gone for the signalling job, because I was thinking, if I get a job in the signal box, maybe I'll end up as a train driver.
Yeah.
So yeah, a train driver.
Probably had more international travel with your current career than as a train driver.
Exactly. I'm glad I took the decision I did.
Yeah. And you're doing training, so not the...
Yeah, it's similar.
Almost. You almost ended up there. What gives you most satisfaction about your job?
Seeing the career progression of students. So I've got someone in mind, particularly. She came to a number of basic trainings at the beginning of her career. I watched her move through her career. She moved up to international. She's someone that I've really enjoyed watching her grow, develop as a person, and now she has a full-time payroll job, but occasionally I'll actually engage her to do work for me in the background. She's good enough to do that. Just seeing someone do that in their career is great. So it's lovely when you can see a student more than the once. And you generally tend to in payroll. Payroll's a relatively small community, so you do tend to bump into people as their careers develop, and that doesn't have to necessarily be a young person either. One of my students on the international diploma, he just reached out to me. He qualified 2 years ago. He's the same age as me, and he told me, I've just taken another job. So this is age 57. gone for a very prestigious job as an international payroll manager, moving from quite a safe public sector environment into, maybe the last throw of the dice, but still confident enough to do that because of in part, the training that he received. So that was very satisfying as well.
Nice. That's great to see. Last question. Imagine I'm a 5-year-old. How would you explain to me what payroll is?
Okay, so I have a 2-year-old granddaughter. Sat in our lounge at the moment is a big wooden cake. And it's in 6 slices that are joined together with Velcro, and there's a candle in each of them. So it's part of the, her little kitchen where we play food. So I'll go to the 5-year-old, right? This is the cake that Granddad gets when he works, but take the knife, go, cut that slice out. I have to give that to that person over there so the street lights outside come in, and I cut the next slice off, and I have to give that to great granddad for his pensions. That's what the government does. And I cut another slice out and go, this is Papoos's pension for me. I'm Papoose, I should have said that. My wife is half Greek Cypriot, so we are Papoose and Yaya, not grandma and granddad. My mum and dad are grandma and granddad. And how much cake have you got left? That's what you're going to have for you to eat. And that's how I explain payroll. It's cutting up the cake.
Take home salary. I like that. Maybe that's how we should explain it to everyone.
And that's an area that perhaps we didn't touch on in the discussion, but I passionately believe we should do more of in payroll. I know they do this in the United States. It's something the APA are quite passionate about. No one told me diddly squat at school about what was going to happen to my wages. It should be a compulsory part of any country's curriculum. You should explain exactly what happens to that money and how you have a responsibility as a voter to oversee that. And you see a salary number in an advert in a paper, you're not going to take that number home. So I think that's an area that we also need to hugely focus on.
No, absolutely. I mean, if I think back my own career, like you said, no one ever sat down and explained your pay slip to you and said, the numbers that you're looking at. And depending on the country, I mean, sort of my mid-career, I ended up working in France, which has a page-long pay slip and lots of abbreviations. And as a non-native speaker, it was virtually impossible trying to understand what was going on, what's being subtracted and added. And usually I would just, probably a lot of people in that situation, eyeball the net amount that said this is going to be paid into your bank account and go, okay, does that feel about right? But I agree with you that if there was more education, people really understood what's happening in your pay slip, in your pay statement, and where the money is going, right? There would be probably a lot less frustration and confusion.
Absolutely. And picking up on that French example, you paid into Azure Carco, the pension things, you bought points on that. Are you checking how much those points are worth every year?
No idea.
The value is revalorized every year. The pension is worked out very simply. It's the number of points multiplied by the value. So it's that need to keep an eye on things long after maybe that employment finished, because you've left some valuable benefits behind there in France.
I will go check after our session. Maybe it's time to retire. All right. So wrapping up, Tim, great conversation, lots of great insights. Any last shout outs, plugs, recommendations you want to do?
I want to come back to that point about the budget of time. So some of you listening to this, you won't be the manager, you'll be the person going to the appraisal. And I suggest you go to your next appraisal with that as an idea. Yeah. So when your manager says, well, what can we do for you? That is a practical suggestion you can put to your manager and say, look, I'd really like this. If we're seeing this as a proper career, and you want me to develop and become, a better, more rounded payroll person, then this is what you can do for me. So, don't be backwards in coming forward. I think the APA have one of the best ideas going. Mark, you'll have seen this at any of their training courses. They always suggest model letters to request the funding for training in the first person. But the thing they do also tell you is write your line manager a brief email after you've been on any training that's involved them having to either pay out money or pay out time. And everyone's interested in ROI, return on investment. So tell that line manager what you got out of it. We're not looking for war and peace, don't bore them. But just a couple of paragraphs on thanks very much for arranging this training. This is what I've got out of it. And this is what I think we need to go off and check as a result of me doing this. I think that's a very useful technique for anyone to adopt.
Yeah. I like it. Thanks, great advice. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for coming on the show today, Tim. It's a pleasure talking.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
I learned a lot, like you said at the beginning. We constantly learn more things in payroll, and this conversation about payroll training education certainly is a topic that, I'll be honest, I don't think about on a daily basis, but getting your perspective on, how we've been doing and where some of these things are taking us has been eye-opening. So thank you so much for sharing this. That brings us to the end of today's episode. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we do release new episodes every couple of weeks. So subscribe, give us a like. That way we can make sure that more people can benefit from the content, and we will stay up to date on what is being released. So until next time, take care.